recording here. Okay, as always tonight, shiur is Le'ilu Nishmat Avi Mori Dov Ber Meir Ben Ruven Alevi Imi Morati Rachel Bat Hara Av Michael. Tonight's shiur is also Le'ilu Nishmat, my grandfather Ruven Ben Moshe Halevi, whose yahrzeit happens to be tonight, 9th day of Iyar. And tonight's parsha, of course, we're going to be talking about the parsha of Emor. So let's get the notes that we need to share on the screen, and away we go. Okay. The parsha of Behar, which is the next to the last parsha in Sefer Vayikra, often read with Bechukotai, very short parsha, but it's a very full parsha in terms of the Torah's social legislation. I think the entire parsha, if I had to give the parsha a title, the parsha is trying to create a society where the rich don't get richer at the expense of the poor, and the poor don't get poorer by filling the pockets of the rich. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Parshas Behar gives us a number of different ways to try to maintain somewhat the equality in terms of distribution of resources. Hold on 1 minute. Let me just pause for 1 minute. Hello? Yes. No, the shiur is only on Zoom tonight. You didn't get the message. I apologize. There was an email that was sent out about a half an hour ago that has the email, that has the link in it. So it's only on Zoom tonight, okay? I'm just getting started. Yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry. Bye. Bye-bye. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So let's start. As I said, the parsha pretty much gives the Torah's suggestions and mitzvot to help us maintain a society where there are fewer people who can no longer support themselves and fewer people who are so ridiculously wealthy that they don't know what to do with their money. Which, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean that it was always successful, but it's supposed to. That seems to be one of the underlying themes of the parsha. So the first thing we have, the first mitzvah that we have in the parsha is, of course, the parsha of Shemitah. And it begins with the mitzvah, where again you'll notice that on the screen you'll see the word haaretz very, very prominently appearing in this parsha, primarily because Hashem is telling us that I've given you Eretz Yisrael as a gift, but you need to use it appropriately and wisely and have the appropriate relationship with the land and the people who are living there, i.e. Bnei Yisrael, the whole Jewish people, who you're supposed to consider, all of whom are your family, your extended family. The key focus here, as I said in blue, Asher ani noten lachem. Hashem wants Bnei Yisrael to understand that it's Hashem's land. It's not ours. It's ours to use because Hashem wants us to be able to use the land, to live on the land, to utilize the land for our physical needs. But there are rules. There are rules to ensure that we don't abuse the land. So the first one that we're given in this week's parasha is the concept of Shemitah. For 6 years, we are to plant. This phraseology outlined in purple is very, very similar to the phraseology of the Shabbat that we have, where we are told 6 days you work, and on the 7th day is a Shabbat to Hashem. So here, 6 years, we are allowed to plant the field, harvest the field, and collect the crops and use them to sustain ourselves. But in the 7th year, the land is to Hashem. Sadacha lo tizra v'charmacha lo tizmar. You are not allowed to plant the field, and you're also not allowed to prune your vineyard, to collect the crops. you may not collect the crops of your field. That in are similarly your grapes. Now again, the question here is, or the fact that the Torah is telling us this is emphasizing the fact that the seventh year, we who are entering Eretz Yisrael, inheriting Eretz Yisrael, the primary occupation of the Jews who are entering Eretz Yisrael is going to be farming, agriculture. Generally, everybody's going to get a piece of land. They're going to farm it. They're going to have all their needs attended to by that plot of land that's going to provide their food. So that's primarily the society that's being established or that's being described by the Torah. But we have to remember that person who owns property tends to think of themselves as the owner. In order to remind us on a regular basis that the land belongs to Hashem, we have the law of Shemitah. Now, the other aspect of Shemitah is that all of the produce that may grow, in other words, all fruit trees, that whatever fruits they bear during the seventh year, are all to be ownerless. Even though we are allowed to eat it, we're not allowed to harvest it the way we would harvest the crop in an ordinary year. So the primary difference between the Shemitah year and any other year in terms of fruit is, firstly, we let the tree grow. We are allowed to do anything to ensure that the tree doesn't die during Shemitah, but we are not allowed to do any work during Shemitah. We're not allowed to plant new trees. We're not allowed to do any work to the tree that will improve the yield during that year. We are allowed, as I said, to maintain the tree to keep it alive and healthy, but that's all. And the converse is that whatever fruit does grow is ownerless, and anybody is allowed to come and take that produce. And similarly, it's to be distributed to everybody to remind us that it really doesn't belong to us, it belongs to Hashem. Then we have the concept of Yovel. Immediately following the concept of Shemitah, we are given the mitzvah of Yovel. We count 7 groups of 7 years, and we have 49 years. And then in the 50th year, on Yom Kippur, the shofar is blown, and that shofar blowing reminds everybody that V'shavtem ish el achuzato, the ish el mishpachto tashuvu, that everybody now returns to their ancestral land, and everybody returns to their family. This is this Torah's way of keeping some type of redistribution of the land so that nobody becomes accumulative of land to the extent that they become super wealthy and other people are becoming super poor. Everybody returns to their ancestral field every 50 years. Now, that might seem like a long time, but it clearly is there again, almost along the concept of the Shemitah, by which through the produce reminds us that the land is Hashem. This says that we never sell land in perpetuity. Land is only leased. Again, we're talking primarily about agricultural land, because we're going to see later on that law that real estate inside cities does not have the same law as agricultural real estate. This halacha of Yovel, of the land returning to its owner at the end of a 50-year period, is primarily talking about agricultural land, because that was seen as the basis of the economy. The agricultural land that produced crops, and that was how the economy was to be supported. That was how the people were to live. The interesting thing we have here is we also have the concept of a person who has sold himself as a slave. At the Yovel year, he goes free, even though the general term was 6 years. If the Yovel interfered in that 6 years, he was to be freed during at the Yovel year. And that's that we have the phrase "Upratem deror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveh," that all of the inhabitants are to be freed from any previous obligation they have. The other aspect of the Shemitah, by the way, I'm going to go back 1 minute, which is not mentioned here, but is mentioned in Sefer Dvarim, is the concept of Shmitat Kisafim, that all loans are also canceled during the Shemitah year. Again, this is to try to keep people from accumulating super wealth at the expense of the poor. So I think from these two aspects, we already begin to see the Torah's concept of trying to maintain an equilibrium in society where we don't divide society into classes of super rich, middle class, and super poor, that everybody is supposed to be relatively, approximately in the same class of having a piece of land, working it agriculturally, and supporting themselves and their family. And I think there are a lot of benefits that come to society when we don't have this type of polarization in wealth among different classes. It perhaps, as I said, if we look at some of the ills of society today, we could possibly say that this is one of the reasons, this super wealthy class and the super poverty class, and everybody else trying to make it happen. So the Torah wants everybody to have a plot of land, because in this society, a plot of land is supposed to be seen as the basis for sustaining a family, for providing for your family through growing crops. And probably you had, a cow, a few goats, maybe a couple of sheep that would help you provide for your regular needs. Okay, again, couple of comments, very similar concept. Yovel year is also, you're not supposed to plant. You're only to eat what grows on its own. And the concept of during the Yovel year, everybody returns to their ancestral plot. Everybody returns to their original plot that was given to them or to their ancestor when Bnai Yisrael inherited Eretz Yisrael in the time of Yoshua. The Torah then continues with the concept of selling agricultural land. When land is sold, it is not sold based on the value of the real estate. It's sold based on the mispar shnei tvuot yimkar lach, how many crops it will yield. So you are basically not selling the land, you are leasing the land based on the number of crops it is going to yield, or we could say you're selling the right to use that land for a number of seasons. And that is how the value of the land is figured out. That is how the contract is written. It is not a sale. And again, the Torah has a very interesting phraseology in Pasuk Yud Zayin of v'lo tonu ish et amito. Do not, one person should not take advantage of his fellow. And v'yareita me'elokecha. We have this very interesting phrase that we saw in Parshat Kedoshim numerous times. V'yareita me'elokecha ki ani Hashem Elokechem. That when we are dealing with something that it is easy for us to rationalize that we weren't doing this to mislead somebody or to trick somebody, the Torah always adds this phrase, v'yareita me'elokecha, that even though you may think you've pulled the wool over the eyes of the person you're dealing with, Hashem knows whether you really were trying to cheat him or not. You may be able to convince others that you weren't, but Hashem certainly knows the answer. Now, the other thing that's highlighted here in red in Pasuk Yud Chet is, again, a very, very interesting closure to this first half of, or this first section of the parsha. And it tells us that Hashem promises us a very, very interesting repayment, if you will, or recompense, but it's not to be seen that way. Hashem has this conditional deal with Bnei Yisrael. If we will fulfill the mitzvot, the chukim, the mishpatim, and vasitem otam, and you will do them, then it says, Vishavtem al haaretz labetach. Hashem promises us that we will live safely, securely in, again, ala Eretz, in Eretz Yisrael, as long as we perform these mitzvot. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us very clearly that failure to keep the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, failure to keep properly the laws, the agricultural laws of giving portions of our produce to the poor, to the Leviim, to the Kohanim, all of those are reasons why we, the Jewish people, may in the future at some point be exiled from Eretz Yisrael, Moshe tells us. And this is written down in Pirkei Avot, that one of the reasons that Galut, it comes to Bnei Yisrael and they are thrown out of Eretz Yisrael, is inappropriate behavior toward the land. If we don't appreciate the land that Hashem has given us and utilize it properly by sharing with those less fortunate than us, by not abusing the privileges that Hashem has given us in use of the land, then we are guaranteed we will stay here. If not, there are dire consequences, Hashem tells us. Now, again, we shouldn't think these are individual. This is a collective, vasitem, plural, vishavtem al haaretz. This is a plural message to Am Yisrael, that if we want to stay safe and secure in Eretz Yisrael, observance of Torah and mitzvot, and specifically those aspects of Torah and mitzvot that relate to the land and relate to sharing the produce and the gifts of the land. And that's the continuation, is in verse Yud-Tet, the nut naharetz piryava chaltem lasova, the land will give its produce and you will be able to eat in plenty. Yishavtem lavetach oleh. Again, similarly, very same phraseology we had in Pasuk Yud-Chet, repeated in Pasuk Yud-Tet, Yishavtem lavetach oleh, you will live securely. The Parshanim ask why it has to say lavetach twice, why we have this twice. Once is the territorial and the security of the nation, and the other is referring to your individual security, your comfort, your peace of mind as an individual living in a society. So that's why, according to Parshanim, this Vishavtem Levetach Aleh is repeated. Now, verse Chaf Aleph, and Chaf Bet, I think are very, very poignant psukim, because they point us directly to the divine authorship of the Torah. There are three psukim here relating to the Shemitah year. Moshe tells us that Hashem says, when you'll say, what am I going to eat during Shemitah year? How can I eat? I can't plant, I can't collect all the crops. And Hashem gives an answer. Hashem promises that the produce of the 6th year will be so abundant and plentiful if we observe the mitzvot, and if we observe, when we are planning on observing Shemitah, that the produce of the 6th year will be so plentiful that we will have enough to eat, not only for the 6th year, but for the 7th year, for the 8th year, until the crops that we planted in the 8th year, which is the year after Shemitah, begin to grow in the 9th year. So Hashem promises us a plentiful crop. Only a divine author would make such a promise, at least in my opinion. And there are other Parshanim. This is not something I made up. This is something I've seen in other Parshanim. This concept of Hashem showing us that clearly these are divine principles. This is not something Moshe made up on his own. Somebody took out of whole cloth to make up. This is Hashem promising us that He is giving us this land. If we will observe His mitzvot and observe them properly, then He promises that everything will be fine. And again, notice the emphasis again in Chav Gimel on the land. We are not allowed to sell the land in perpetuity. Ki li haaretz, because Hashem says the land belongs to me. Ki gerim mitoshavim atem imadi. We are settlers who are living on Hashem's land as long as we abide by the rules to live in this land. Again, this is the emphasis over and over again of Parshat Behar. Parshat, later on, we're going to see it again in next week's Parshat Bechukotai. This is Hashem's promise to Am Yisrael that when we live up to our end of the bargain, Hashem will live up to His end of the bargain as it relates to living in Eretz Yisrael, as it relates to prospering in Eretz Yisrael. But again, it's a conditional package. We have to live up to our conditions, especially as we see in this parasha, in relation to those around us who we're sharing this land with. Pasuk Chav Hey and the next part of the parasha begin again more of the same aspects, but these now are relating to sale of property outside of the family unit. Again, when your brother reaches a stage where he's poor. Now, again, the assumption that is that as long as you've got your plot of land and you work it and there's plenty, you'll have plenty to eat. If you become poor, it probably means that something has gone wrong with that cycle, with that system. Somehow you have either lived beyond your means or somehow the crops have not grown either for you as an individual or for this area as a whole. And somebody has to sell a piece of his ancestral property. There is a rule that says, Hashem says that when a property is put up for sale, again, we're talking primarily here about agricultural property. When I have to sell my agricultural plot, the Torah places the first burden of purchasing that plot on my closest family members, my Goel. My Goel is my redeemer, who is my closest relative on my father's side, because the land was divided up by paternal families. So therefore, Go'alo, the redeemer, the first right of redemption of buying this field to basically give it back to me belongs to the closest male relative on the father's side. Again, the purpose here is that the plot of land should not be farmed outside, should not leave the family to be farmed outside of the family, so that the family maintains its connection to that piece of land, because that was the piece of land that the family was allotted when Eretz Yisrael was conquered in the time of Yoshua. Again, if on the other hand, the person is not able, or the Goel is not able to redeem it, he is allowed. The Torah gives him the ability. If he has sold the land for a certain number of years, and in the middle of the interim of that period of time that he has sold it for, he is able to recapture enough money, or gain enough money, or earn enough money to buy that field back, he gets the right to buy back, even if the seller doesn't wish to sell. He can force the seller to sell it back to him, because as the original owner of the land, he has the right to do it. On the other hand, if he doesn't, in Yovel, as we have said before, then if he is not able to redeem it or pay back even a partial after number of years, it remains with the buyer until Yovel, but in Yovel it returns again, because the Yovel is what we call the great equalizer, where all property returns back to its original owner. Excuse me for 1 minute. Okay, now, verse 29, the Torah begins to tell us a different type of metric. We are now talking not about the agricultural property. We're now talking about property within cities, which has a very different, entirely different rule. If you sell a house in a walled city, that's completely different. You, the buyer, you the seller, have 1 year. 300, I think it's not 1 year, it's 12 months, or if it's a leap year, you get 13 months, but you have till the next year, the same date it was sold, you have 1 calendar year to rebuy that field, to earn the money to rebuy that home. And if not, if at the end of 1 full year you have not redeemed it, then this house, which is in a walled city, is sold in perpetuity to the new purchaser, and lo yetze by yovel. This is not, this house, this property does not come under the rubric of yovel because it is not a food generating property. It is not an agricultural property. It is a dwelling. It is a dwelling inside a walled city, and hence it has an entirely different rule. Now, interestingly enough, the Torah then continues with, excuse me one second, where am I? I just lost my place here. Okay, however, ubatei chatzerim, houses in open areas, non-walled cities, asher ein lahem chom masaviv, which do not have a wall, al sadei haaretz yechoshev, a city that is not a walled city has the same halacha in terms of selling and buying as a field. Geula tielo by yovel yetze. It is, you can redeem it at any time up till the yovel, and if you haven't redeemed it yet at yovel, it goes back to the original owner. Again, the rationale being that houses that were built in open areas were built there primarily because they were adjacent to the fields that were being worked, as opposed to houses in city which were not adjacent to agricultural areas in walled cities. That's the difference. The Torah makes that difference very clear. And if we go back, as I said, to the agrarian society envisioned by the Torah, the primary income generating property was agricultural property, not residential commercial real estate. Unlike today's society, if you're trying to buy in a place in Modi'in, good luck, but it's a very different demographic, it's a very different economic system, and the Torah is trying to ensure equal, equitable distribution of food producing, i.e. income producing property. And that's why a lot of these halachot are the way they are. They may not seem to fit with today's society, but that was the society in which they were written, and that is the society in which they were practiced. Finally, a separate law. The Levium have a separate rule as far as their cities are concerned, because their cities are the equivalent of their agricultural land. Cities that were allotted to the Leviim are given with the same caveats as agricultural land, that they are to be allowed to be redeemed at any time, and in Yovel they return to the Leviim, and the Torah tells us why. So even if there was a Levitical city that was walled, nonetheless the houses within them had the law of agricultural property, and the area around there was a belt around the Levitical cities of Sodei, Migrash, Aream, Lo Yimocher, could not be sold. Again, could be leased agriculturally, although you weren't allowed to. There were a lot of things you were not allowed to do in this land. It was zoned very specifically. The Migrashim, the first 1,000 amot around the Levitical cities had specific laws in terms of what could be and couldn't be done there, but it could not be sold in perpetuity. Because again, it was to the Levium. So here we have in these few parshiot the laws of land ownership, land distribution, and land redistribution every 50 years in general, to ensure the equity within society of, as I said, of what was perceived to be the most important income producing property. Now, we go into further halachot here, which relate similarly to laws of commerce, laws of trade. If your brother becomes poor and you have to lend him money, you should lend him money. You should strengthen him by either lending him money or finding him a job or whatever he might need. But when you lend money, the rules against taking interest. And again, this very interesting phrase of the Eretz Elokecha, that we have to know that, quote, Hashem is watching us, Hashem is keeping an eye on how we're treating each other, and therefore we have an obligation in our business dealings, in our commerce, in terms of treating people equitably. This is an important aspect. And again, Hashem tells us why. Ani Hashem Elokechem asher hoteti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am Hashem who brought you out of Mitzrayim. Lateit lachem et haaretz et Eretz Canaan liot lachem lelokim. Again, Hashem closes another section with this same reminder that Hashem has taken us out of Mitzrayim specifically to give us Eretz Canaan, but specifically to give us this land in a way that our living on it, the way we live, the way we work this land, the way we build a society, is to remind us always that the land is a gift from Hashem. Hashem gave us our freedom, gave us this land so that we can build a society that gives honor to Hashem, that gives glory to the name of Hashem, that teaches the world that yes, you can build an honest, ethical, moral society. It's not impossible. We show the world how to do it. And that's why it is so important for us individually and collectively to build and support that type of society, because that's what we're here for. That's what the Jewish people were put in Eretz Yisrael for by Hashem. And unfortunately, when we don't live up to that mission, Hashem tells us you have to leave Eretz Yisrael because you didn't do the job you were supposed to be doing. And now that we're back after a 2,000-year hiatus, we have to remember that. We have to treat other people the same way that we would want to be treated in all of our business dealings, in everything we do. And I think that's really the whole focus of parshat Behar, that Hashem has given us a framework under which we can build an economy, build a society that lives by the principles of the Torah. And I hope and pray that we, as well as those who we have elected and chosen to be our leaders and make the laws that help us live by the laws of the Torah and build the society that we can be proud of, will understand that, even though they may not understand all the nuances of that. But if they don't understand that the Jewish people are here to build an ethical, moral society, then we will have failed. And we hope and pray that our leaders will lead us in the right direction, and we will help them so that we can be at that Or LaGoyim. We can show the world how we should be living our lives, and we can be Zocher Tegula Shlema. Thank you very much. I open up now for comments, questions, feedback, because
Aaron.
I need to stop talking for a few minutes.
Aaron?
Yes.
Hi.
David,
Hi.
are you still in the Holy Land? Are you back? You're still here?
I'm still in the Holy Land for about another 6 hours. So,
okay.
Hi.
Good to hear you. How you doing?
Good. So we no longer live in an agricultural society in the same way as they did when those laws were prescribed for us. The basic principles are evident, but the practicality seems not a lot more than academic interest.
I can say yes, and I will say no. Yes, because we, today, when we came back, we did not get the land back that our ancestors have, because we have no idea who our ancestors have, what tribe they're from, and what land they had. So that's one piece of the puzzle that's missing. Secondly, as the fact is that today's society runs very differently than the society ran back then. However, the principles of commerce, of fair trade, of fair value for your dollar certainly apply in any society and in any time. And we need to be aware of that.
I agree. I agree. Yeah.
And I think, while, as I said, some of the particulars may not apply, and certainly there is a whole debate as to whether the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, when they do apply as Torah laws and when they're only rabbinic laws. I mean, in our day, virtually all of the all of the authorities agree that when we keep Shemitah, we're only keeping it as a rabbinic law to remember the fact that there is Shemitah. Whereas there's a debate among the Parshanim as to when and what would cause it to revert to being a Torah law. Now, there's one opinion that says, well, in order for it to be a Torah law, we have to have a Sanhedrin again. There's another opinion that says, no, you only need a majority of the Jewish people living in the Holy Land. Which of those we will eventually reach first, I don't know. Whether we'll reach either or both of those at any time soon, I don't know. Only Hashem knows how that will play out. But again, because so there is such a small percentage, and this is not just in Israel, this is worldwide, of people who now work in agriculture, and the way that food is provided is so different than it was then. I would suspect that that when the Mashiach comes, and we rebuild the Beit HaMikdash and we reestablish the Sanhedrin, or maybe that will happen before. I don't know how they will approach these halachot, because again, there is such a difference between how land is used, when land is used for agricultural purposes versus when it's used for non-agricultural purposes. And the value of that land has very different values. There are so many things that we think of today in terms of our values, financial, in terms of the financial value of different things, that make it very challenging for us to even try to imagine what these laws would look like when they're reinstated. I don't know. I mean, I know we all, those of us who live here or have lived here longer than 7 years, understand that Shemitah has a whole different set of laws that govern it. But other than saying, okay, so it's Heter Mechira, or it's Oter Besdin, or it's Yevul from outside of, or it's produce that's brought from outside of Eretz Yisrael that I'm buying, what difference does it make? Because we're not farmers generally. Generally, we're not, have a plot of land in our backyard that we're farming that determines how much we're going to have to eat. That's very different today. And as such, that whole aspect of Shemitah, most of us are totally unaware of. I mean, okay, we have a house plant, we know we have to have it inside rather than outside. And if it's outside, it's got to be covered. Otherwise, it's governed by Shemitah rules. So some of us may have some idea in terms of, if we have certain plants, if we had a mirpeset with a plant on it versus a plant that was inside the house, and we've been here for a Shemitah, we know that there are differences in the halacha and how those are treated. But otherwise, unless you've studied the laws of Shemitah, you probably don't have a whole lot of exposure to Shemitah at all from the growing place. As I said, we do from the harvesting, we do have a greater interaction with Shemitah. But again, not in the same way. It's a very different interaction as a consumer rather than as a producer. Okay? So how all that will play out future, I don't know. Good question. Anybody else? Questions, comments, feedback? Okay, thank you all for joining. I apologize, it was a little bit shorter tonight because I think my throat's starting to get a little dry. But I hope everybody should have a great week and everybody should be well. And Bezrat Hashem, I can't tell you whether next week we'll still be on only on Zoom or I'll be back in the shul. I don't know. It depends on how my tests go later in the week. So everybody stay well, and we'll see you all. Bye, Lato.
Before I see you, take care.